Hunter. My day job is I'm budget and evaluation manager for the city of Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I also serve on the Chamber of Commerce's Small Business Committee, and this webinar is designed to provide you with an outlook on the economy for the current year 2016 and also kind of give you some insight about what it'll mean for Rocky Mount and the Twin County area. Just to give you a quick overview, there are a lot of sources where this information comes from. You can see some of those there on your screen. You'll see a lot of charts that are branded by Fred, which is an economic data clearinghouse that's operated by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. There's a lot of other sources. Another source that I use heavily is actually the economics group at Wells Fargo Securities. They're actually based out of Charlotte and do a phenomenal job writing up summaries and reports on the economic releases as they take place. This presentation itself wouldn't have been possible without Clint Williams' help and also the gateway that we're using, which is being provided to us by BB&T Bank. So I want to thank Clint and also thank BB&T for their support. Also, for everybody who did register in advance and for all the Small Business Committee members, you will receive a PDF of this presentation shortly after this presentation concludes. And for everybody else, this session is also being recorded, and as such, we will post this as soon as we can online. We did not intend for this session to conflict with the UNC game that's going on right now. I'm not from North Carolina originally, so I still have issues for getting that tournament week is kind of a sacred time for people's schedules, particularly during the day. Try to do better next time. Quick overview of what we're going to do. What I will present to you is a lot of information that is aggregated at both at the national level, the state level for North Carolina, as well as some local information of interest for the Rocky Mount metropolitan area. You will see that when I show you this information, when you see the slide deck, you're going to see a lot of historic information tied to the current so that you can kind of get an idea of where the trends are. And we're going to cover a lot of different topics, and many of them have to do with information that we have in the past and the present. I also want to spend some time to talk about the future and what that holds for our region. There are some challenges that we have seen, and I want to talk a little bit about what those challenges are, but also how those challenges are going to evolve for the global economy, the national economy, and also particularly the local economy. First, let's start off with the national economy, and as you can see, we are seeing continued growth at the national level. When we look at gross domestic product, I prefer to look at it from the perspective of real GDP, which means dollars that are chained and you've adjusted for inflation. And as you can see, in the past year, based on the most recent numbers, which came out just about a week ago, at the end of 2015, our GDP was at an annualized rate of about $16.45 billion. We've significantly, of course, made up from that dip that you see there in 2008 and 2009 that was a result of the recession, the credit crisis, the mortgage crisis, and every other crisis we can imagine that led to a recession but not a depression. So in the past calendar year, we saw growth in GDP of about $300 billion nationwide, which translates to about a 1.9% annual growth rate for 2015. It is, of course, you can see it is down from what we saw in 2014, which was about 2.5%. The key thing to look here, and you've probably heard the phrase new normal a lot when looking at the economy, and what you will notice, that red line that is across there, that is the average annual GDP growth from 1980 till 2005. And during that 25-year period, that quarter century benchmark, we were seeing an annual growth rate of about 3%. And as you can see, since really about 2005, we have either been below or right at that growth rate pretty much on a regular basis. And it does reflect a little bit of a challenge because, in general, a 3% growth rate enables us to absorb inflation, maintain relatively healthy interest rates, and as well kind of allowed us to kind of see that overall that there was growth across all sectors of the economy. And as we have significantly seen in this last slowdown and rebound since about 2007, 2008, what we have noticed that there's been some significant shifts in the economy with respect to particular sectors, with respect to particular industries, and of course that's also had an effect on jobs, and it's also had an effect geographically in terms of what areas have grown and what areas haven't. Of course, one of the things that affects real GDP and affects a lot of things, including purchasing power of the consumer, is inflation. And as you can see, there's two ways of looking at inflation. And these numbers are, they've only been updated through January. February's numbers will be in next week. The Consumer Price Index that's maintained by the Department of Commerce, as you can see, if you took all of the components that are part of calculating the Consumer Price Index, it's only gone up about 1.4% for the year as of January, less than 1% within the past 3-month period. But that also takes into inclusion the impact of fuel costs. And I'm going to go quickly to the next slide and just show you, everybody is aware of just how much fuel prices have dropped compared to what we were used to for several years. Both in that upper left-hand corner, the price for crude oil. Even in mid-2014, we were seeing crude trade between $100 and $120 a barrel consistently. Now, for several months, pretty much since the beginning of 2016, we have been below $40 a barrel. We've seen a little bit of improvement. That's had a huge effect on gas prices. We were consistently paying in the neighborhood of $3.50, in the average of $3.50 a gallon back in mid-2014, even the spring of 2014, and now we're paying below $2 a gallon. We've seen a little bit of an increase, and a lot of that is because of supply starting to be contracted a little bit. And as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, that's that dark brown line reflects the number of oil rigs in operation. And as you can see, because of the sharp decline in oil prices, a lot of production has gone offline. This is particularly true in the areas that saw the most significant oil exploration in the last decade, which were those areas where they were, of course, working with shale, oil sands, and other methods that have helped increase overall supply and production, but are actually more expensive than simply drilling in the ground. And as a result, many of those cases, they had to stop production because they simply couldn't afford it. Some of this is due to global demand contraction. A lot of it is also due to the fact that other countries, including the Middle East, have significantly increased their production and distribution in order to try to make some money. Same is true for Russia. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice that right now, the EIA, which is a federal agency that looks at overall at energy forecasting, when they look at where we are with respect to production, they do not expect production to be passed by consumption. And that's important because right now, overall storage supplies in the United States, there's some analysts that are suggesting that they will actually reach full capacity very quickly, which means not only are we able to meet current demands, but we will have exhausted all of our available capacity in the United States to store oil. And even though Congress did pass legislation recently in the last year that now allows for the United States to export crude oil, something it had not been able to do for a very long time, there is some concerns as to whether or not there's really a market for that. Had they done it a couple of years ago, there likely would have been. But in particular, what we've seen in Europe, where there's been a tremendous drawdown in the economy, those of you who kind of follow financial news may have heard something about the Europeans actually doing another round of quantitative easing or monetary policy stimulus, which they started today. They made an announcement around lunchtime. That's an indication that there are some areas of the world that are seeing a softening in their economies, and that is, of course, reducing their demand for energy, their demand for oil, and that is, of course, having an impact overall on oil prices, which is great at the gas pump, but it does have an overall questionable effect on the market. What we are noticing, however, if you look at the chart on the right with respect to core prices, which takes out the impact of energy, takes out the reflection of oil, it also takes out food. What you've seen is that you're starting to see a pickup in inflation. And this is something that the Federal Reserve has looked at with respect to interest rates. which of course they are a barometer as well about economic health. Since the recession, the Federal Reserve's interest rate has been pretty much at 0%. Only in the last couple of months did they raise it to 0.25%. Typically, prior to the recession, the interest rate was in the neighborhood of 5%. And that, of course, impacts mortgage rates. Mortgage rates remain at historic lows. But overall, one of the things they've been looking for is for inflation to pick up. And from the standpoint of businesses, we know that there are costs that are being increased on business, particularly small business, and the ability to be able to start raising prices to be able to offset some of those producer cost or business cost increases is important. It all has to be balanced, and of course there are market forces that affect it as well that can prevent you from being able to absorb all the cost increase on your side as a business owner. But obviously there is some action starting to be seen with respect to inflation, and it'll also likely lead at some point to the Fed to continue to raise interest rates, which is something that they know they need to do in order to ensure the overall health of the U.S. economy. Covered oil there. With respect to the market, we know that 2016 has been a wild ride so far. 2015 in general wasn't a bad time for the market, but it didn't exactly grow all that much. And looking at the S&P 500, you can see that overall the market is down for 2016. The Dow has, in some ways, kind of recovered from its prior losses. Not as much sure about the Nasdaq, but the S&P still has a ways to go in order to get back to where it was at the start of the calendar year. One thing that I look at in particular is looking at different sectors of the economy, and you can see some elements of the economy have actually seen some growth. Surprisingly, energy stocks have improved, industrial stocks, utility stocks, as well as basic consumer products. Overall, there's actually some health in the consumer industry. The consumers are continuing to buy. I know for some businesses right now, this is a very good time of year because of tax refunds and because more people are working. There was improvement in employment this past year, including in our area, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It has resulted in some, of course, people not only getting some more in terms of take-home income throughout the year, but also more in terms of tax refunds. And so that's having an impact. But we also see that there are some drags, including in technology, discretionary incomes, even though we've seen some improvement in areas like auto sales. Overall, discretionary stocks have not done as well. But in particular, you can see two areas that have had significant lag on the overall stock market. Healthcare, we're familiar with some of the losses that health insurance companies are facing, like Blue Cross here in North Carolina. They've talked about that, as well as in the financial sector. Those areas are being negatively affected, and it's bringing down the markets overall. But again, when it comes to if you happen to have a stock portfolio or investment portfolio, it really depends on what you're invested in as to how you're doing in terms of your stock performance. Overall, however, this graph here is from the St. Louis Fed. They try to measure, and they've got a very complicated formula that I'm not going to go into, to overall monitor financial stress, which is a good indicator of where we are. And as you can see, while it has picked up a little bit since 2014, it is still in the negative territory, which is a good sign. And as you can see, it's nowhere near where it was during the recession, even in the buildup to the recession. If we started to see that this stress index was going above zero and was starting to climb some, then there might be some concern for the overall condition in the market and the possibility of a recession. But right now, that stress index remains in the negative territory, which is a good thing for the economy overall. Also, with respect to treasuries, this is important. One, because it indicates the overall health of the economy, that there's still a lot of demand for treasuries. Some of that's now being driven by people trying to move their money out of some other markets around the world, some softening in the stock market. It's, of course, one of the things it has done is that it has allowed the federal government to borrow considerably. I mean, in the last 8 years, we've seen a near doubling in the national debt. And it's allowed the federal government to borrow money while basically paying the same amount in interest as they did 8 years ago. It's kind of like you get a credit card with a 10% interest rate, and the bank comes back and says, well, we'll double your credit limit, and we're going to have your interest rate. So as a result, your debt service is the same and you can borrow more money. Well, that's what's kind of happened with treasuries. You can see where it was around 2000. Overall, all grades of treasuries, including the shortest terms, the 1 years, and their smaller terms, but typically the 1 year is the one that's in, and that's one that the treasuries use a lot, was over 6%, and now that is still below 1%. And most of the money that the federal government borrows is borrowed with short-term notes. They just keep reissuing those notes, and it's the way that they're able to structure the debt so that the debt service on it is as low as possible. If treasuries increase, and they're going to eventually, you can see where they were before the recession at about 5%. If and when they increase, there's going to be pressure on the federal budget, because at that point the debt service gets to a level that it starts affecting the availability of revenue within the Treasury. And it also is an indication that they can't go out and borrow as much money. It's going to require deficit reduction. So it's going to be a kind of a double whammy on the federal budget side, that they're not only going to have to set aside more money to pay the debt, they're actually going to have to reduce deficits, and that, of course, shrinks the availability of money for the federal government. And, of course, that's when you start getting into political discussions in terms of what that impact is going to be overall. Now to start to look at employment, and as you can see, we are continuing to see growth in the job market nationally. Employment continues to grow. It has pretty much been growing since 2010. It really didn't have that much further to go down. There was a huge loss. We saw about a loss of over 8 million jobs nationally during the recession. And we've seen about a growth of around 13 million jobs since 2010. Now, of course, there's been a lot of questions about what these jobs are. In general, many of these jobs are part-time, but we have started seeing more full-time employment, more growth in permanent employment, and improvement in wages. There's a lot of extra charts I could have added, but for the sake of time, didn't want to just overburden y'all with respect to these charts. But this is a key indicator nationally of where we are going. But there is one aspect that does need to be taken into consideration. Also looking at hiring. Hiring activity continues to improve. It does kind of go back and forth due to seasonal aspects, but the trend overall, particularly from 2010, is continuing to see growth in hiring at the national level. And of course, this is also true for North Carolina, and even true for Rocky Mountain. We'll show that information in just a little bit. The big thing, however, that there is a difference in, and it does have an effect on policy, and it does have an effect on the economy, is labor force participation. We showed earlier, I just showed one or two charts ago, about how we have seen significant increase in jobs overall and in hiring, but in reality, it is still not kept up with the overall labor supply to really match up to where we can say that the same percentage of our overall population is employed. And what's really happened is, and of course this is a statistical calculation, the labor force participation rate, where we look at the percentage of people that are participating in the labor force compared to the population as a whole. And as you can see, prior to the recession, and for the last, I'd say, since about the 1980s, we were in that range that overall labor force participation was at about 66 to 67%. And that's kind of where it was before the recession. And what we've seen now is a drop from about 66 to 67% to around 62 to 63%. It has started to have a little bit of an uptick. There's several factors involved with that. First of all, there's been the impact of retirement. There's also just simply been that a lot of people have left the workforce. Either they've stopped looking for work, they've taken disability. There's been a high number of disability applications that have been submitted and accepted by the government, which has moved people out of the workforce. So there have been multiple factors. And of course, what that means is that you have a smaller supply of the overall population force that are actually active and working, which of course it means fewer people overall as a percentage making an income, and it means fewer people paying for the overall cost of society, whether it's as consumers or as taxpayers. Going a step further and looking at labor force participation between the ages of 25 and 54, that key 30-year period of employment and wealth generation for most individuals, you can see that level has dropped off from a little around 84% to about 81% at where it is now. And again, that is significant because that's really the population that drives the overall economy with respect to their labor. Now let's talk about North Carolina. And as we said, overall, GDP growth in the past year has been about 2% nationally. And these numbers are only, the state numbers are a little slower to get. Generally, when economic information comes out, the earliest numbers are national, and then it takes longer time to get the state numbers, and then it's the longest time to get the local numbers. And in fact, overall, when it comes to GDP, metro area numbers are only provided on an annual basis, but they do provide quarterly numbers for state GDP. And as you can see, overall, North Carolina is doing better than the national average. North Carolina is tied for the largest growth rate. Actually, it has the highest growth rate in the Southeast at 2.8%. There are several. The South overall is doing well. Not as it's not the strongest. The strongest being the Rocky Mountain area, which is interesting. But that's actually driven also by some mining and energy activities, as well as in the Plains regions, which is being driven by mining and agriculture. You can see down in the Southwest, even in Texas, people wonder about that. That's not an indication of economic weakness. That's the impact of the oil sector and the fact that with oil production going down, states like Texas and Oklahoma and even North Dakota, as you can see up there at negative 3.4%, have taken a hit because of the impact of the oil industry on their overall economy. But even in the case of places like Texas, they have seen economic growth in other sectors. But North Carolina has done well overall, and as you can see, so have many other parts of the Southeast. Looking at North Carolina's GDP overall, when you're looking at it from the perspective of real GDP, you can see that that it's estimated for in the last year that our GDP has grown by about $12 billion. And that's pretty significant for a state. I mean, we're not by any means the largest state in the country. You look at some of the states like Texas and California, that their GDP is greater than that of most of the industrialized world, most industrialized countries individually. We're not in that area, but we are still doing well, and you can see that we have certainly caught back up from where we were in 2007, 2008, and have far surpassed that as a state. Looking where that growth is from a sector perspective, you can see that we've seen growth in mining in certain areas, and that's been nationwide growth. You also see that agriculture. And this has been something where some of the state economists, the Mike Waldens, the John Conantons, have always wondered, when is the agriculture side going to start slacking off a little bit? And they keep wondering if it's going to, and it keeps growing. Agriculture has been a significant boon to the overall economy of North Carolina for several years. And it's also had an impact on the growth in eastern North Carolina. You can also see growth in construction, manufacturing, retail, of course the information sectors, the management sector, tying back to our major metropolitan areas, science and such. And those other sectors, while the growth rates are not as significant, are really the driving forces overall of North Carolina's economy. And this is just in the past year. If you were to look this over a larger period of time, you would see more balance. The last thing I will notice down there at the bottom, there's been no growth in government in the past year. And overall, if you looked at real GDP for North Carolina, when you take all government together, state and local, and even the influence of federal government around here, it has not seen a lot of growth. And that is having an economic effect in certain areas. Probably the most notable have been in the military metros, Fayetteville, Jacksonville, Goldsboro. They have actually seen some declines in the last couple of years, and a lot of that's being driven by sequester-related cuts to defense spending and some realignments in troops and some drawdown in troops. And in particular, in the last year or so, Fayetteville has seen some reductions in its overall GDP, and many of these areas have seen reductions in employment as a result of the impact of those actions being taken by the federal government. Just want to take a moment to talk about, we've seen growth in GDP, and a lot of it's being driven by the strength of our business climate. And just show you a couple of charts here, and these were actually provided as part of some presentations that were done. This comes from the Tax Foundation, but these were put together by someone who we've consulted a little bit with at the city, and he's had a chance to present to the public as a whole, and that's Ted Abernathy. I did want to show this one because it does provide some good information about how we look overall, and some of this is tied to the actions of the legislature as well as some actions at the local level. And what you can see is that North Carolina, from a tax policy perspective, is in good overall shape. It's in the top 20. It's not the top 10, but overall, with respect to tax policy, it's in the top 20. It was not in that position a couple of years ago, and as I've talked about, actions being taken across the board in various places. But you can also see certainly that we're not in as bad of shape as some of the other states are that are in the bottom 10. You see which ones are the top 10. We're kind of in the middle. Overall, that's pretty much consistent with the Southeast. You'll notice down below is South Carolina is at 37, and the reason is they are more dependent upon incentives. Their overall tax structure is not as good, but they do a lot more with the incentives. We've seen that from the standpoint of competition for manufacturing. But overall, North Carolina's business climate is in good condition with respect to economic growth. Want to take this opportunity, some other information to look at. This is a little more of a drill down. There's two charts we're going to show you. And if you look at North Carolina, what you see is, obviously you want to try to avoid the red and hopefully get to green. And what you can tell is, and this is for the southern states, what works for North Carolina is that you're not going to see any red for North Carolina on this page or the next page. When it comes to tax rankings, we're not necessarily the best, but overall we're either good or in the middle. A state like Tennessee, where I'm from originally, you can see it does a very good job with corporate and individual income tax because it practically doesn't have any. But unfortunately, that puts more pressure on sales tax and property tax, which, depending on the type of business you're doing, could have more of an impact. There are some trade-offs depending on how your tax structure is. When you look at it from the standpoint of regulation, you can say that North Carolina is actually doing a good job overall. 14th with respect in the nation with respect to regulatory policy, 21st in economic freedom, and then 5 with respect to the legal environment. And of course, each businesses have individual cases which can affect their opinions about the overall legal environment. But from an aggregate perspective, North Carolina looks pretty good for business. Now it's time to talk about Rocky Mount. And again, GDP information on metropolitan areas is presented on an annual basis, typically provided in the fall of each year for the prior year. So, of course, all we can do is go back to 2014. And what you see is something that Rocky Mount continues to be challenged by. Our overall GDP for 2014 was a little under 6.2 billion. And as you can see, when it's chained for inflation, if it had not been chained, it would have probably been actually up a little bit. But because it's chained for inflation, that actually was a slight decrease from where we were last year. You can also tell it's remained relatively stagnant since about 2011. And, we see that from the standpoint of, we can tell that from our perspective with respect to job activity, business activity, sales activity. I will tell you right now, based on the work that I do for the city from the standpoint of monitoring our economy and from the standpoint of conversations I've had with business owners and conversations that I've had with employers and with individuals, I do expect to see that GDP number go up for 2015. Can't tell you by how much, but I do think it will go up. This compares Rocky Mount to other metropolitan areas in the state. Again, the three jurisdictions that are the jurisdictions that are in decline for the last year in 2014 include Fayetteville and Jacksonville, and that goes back to the military issue. But then you look at the areas that have seen some growth. Obviously, Greensboro had a good year at 4.8%. It had actually seen some declines. It was struggling to recover at the same level that areas like Durham and Chapel Hill and Asheville had been. Durham, Asheville, and Raleigh are going up at pretty consistent rates in the neighborhood of around 4 to 5%, and they've been doing that on an annual basis now for several years. Greenville around 3 to 4%. Winston-Salem actually saw the most significant growth at 6% for 2014, and they had very similar to what Greensboro High Point had experienced. they had not been growing at the same pace as the Triangle or the Charlotte area. I apologize, Charlotte's not in this chart, but Charlotte's growth is in the neighborhood the same as where Durham and Raleigh are from that perspective. Now to look a little closer at Rocky Mount. One of the things I do for our city council and for the senior management of the city is provide them information on monthly employment. This information is provided from the state and from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what we track, a lot of times there will be a lot of focus on the employment rate or the unemployment rate. I'm more interested in job growth and employment, and job growth and labor force growth. That's really what I focus on, because to me, it goes back to jobs equals salary or wages, wages equals purchasing power, the ability for people, whether it's to pay off debt, keep current on their bills, hopefully have more discretionary income, which really helps build the local economy. What we're starting to see, and this is the information for 2015, what we saw in 2015 in terms of overall activity was a trend that was relatively consistent to what we saw in 2014, where we see that employment activity kind of grows a little bit in the early part of the year, tapers off in the mid part, and then sees a significant rebound towards the fall. And I'm still trying to work on the reasons for that, but we saw this same pattern last year. And what we've started to notice is that while we lag in terms of performance, perhaps during the first 6 to 9 months of the year, when it comes to job growth at the end of the year, we outsurpass most of the other metropolitan areas in the state. And this next chart kind of shows that. What you'll see overall is that and if you look at the area that's boxed in, that's the Rocky Mount MSA as well as the city of Rocky Mount. And what you'll see is that in the blue bars, which is for the entire year, you'll see that our overall growth was about 1.1%. Obviously, we wish we can do better, but you'll notice that several other metropolitan areas did not do as well. And if it was not for Wilmington, we would be the best in, if it wasn't for Wilmington, we would be the best in eastern North Carolina. And Wilmington, of course, is not like the rest of eastern North Carolina in a lot of ways. But, you've got Wilmington and Greenville, but they did not see as much growth. But the real difference, if you look at the yellow bar and what's happened just in the last 6 months, and you'll see that job growth has been about 3.4% just in the past 6 months. And it's very similar to the trend that we saw in 2014. So hopefully what we will see is that we can see an improvement in the activity in the earlier parts of the year, and hopefully we'll see that this year. We're still looking to see. But if that does occur and we see a continuation of that strong fall push in employment, then that means that our overall employment picture for the region will continue to improve. We still continue to see the job growth at over 4% in the Charlotte area and Greensboro, and over 3% in areas like Durham and Raleigh. And theirs is more, what you could say is more consistent over time. Overall, metro areas continue to outpace statewide employment. That's reflective of a trend that's a long-standing trend. It's not something that just started with this most recent recovery, but it is a trend that is accelerating even more so with respect to how metro area employment is outsurpassing the statewide, which would include the non-metro areas. There's continuation of moving jobs from rural to urban areas, particularly in the skilled areas, those that involve higher education levels. Now, some of you have seen charts like this with respect to the national economy. I do want to show it with respect to Rocky Mount. You can see, if you looked at the dips, how the pattern that we're starting to see is that way. We're hoping to see that pattern start shifting so that we can start seeing those green and orange lines increase. But my hope is that as we go into 2016, that we will start seeing the trajectory move upward on a regular basis and not have as deep of dips that we've seen the last couple of years. Now let's take a look towards the future. Really what's going to be going on in the next 12 months. And this is just some various indices that are out there that provide this information. This is the index of leading economic indicators. This is basically showing levels of improvement. and overall it remains in positive territory. It did subside a little bit in the early part of 2015, but it has started to pick back up and improve throughout the course of the year going into 2016. And again, it is being driven by the consumer. Consumers are overall a little more optimistic than businesses are, even though when I was in Raleigh for an economic presentation earlier this year that was at a Raleigh Chamber event, when they asked the business owners, in general, most of them were optimistic. So, and I have heard that as well from other business owners. But that doesn't mean that that necessarily carries throughout the year. There are uncertainties, and of course we know that this is an election year. And during election years, particularly when you're going to have a change in office because of the fact that there will be a new president next year, sometimes the negative is focused on more than the positive with respect to the economy to encourage greater change. And that is something that we've definitely noticed on both sides in both parties with respect to what's going on in the primaries. They are focusing a lot on the negatives with respect to the economy, and that does, of course, drive a push for potential change, which does start making businesses and consumers a little anxious about where the economy is going. Looking at business activity, these international supply management, their indexes, and you can see there is some drop off, but the numbers remain in manufacturing do remain above. The average overall is right at around 50, which 50 is the key number for the manufacturing index. It is a little bit of concern, but again, it has been there. Typically this time of year, it does drop down a little bit. There are a lot of people have large supplies, but when you look at the non-manufacturing side, overall the 12-month average is good, but we are starting to see a little bit of dip in the non-manufacturing in the service side. And again, one of the things to look at with respect to the economic growth in this recovery is that it's been driven by the service sector. With respect to small business, earlier this week the NFIB came out with their monthly small business optimism report. For the last couple of months, small businesses have been concerned. 100 is kind of the index number to tell the difference between average optimism and above and below average optimism. And as you can see, it did drop overall down to about 92.9. It is still not where it was back in the in some parts of the recovery period. So it could potentially go up and come back up, or it could stabilize. Of course, the main concern is with respect to plans for growth. And as you can see there, increasing employment has started to cap off capital outlays. Definitely, of course, decreasing of inventory. The big one there, the fourth one, expecting the economy to improve. I think a lot of that's being driven by politics, but it's also probably being driven by some real factors out there. When you look at small business hiring, however, you are continuing to see some activity, and there are plans to hire about 12%, and it's continuing to creep up. But the big one in that light blue one is having to do with hard to fill openings. The biggest challenge overall, and having talked to employers here, the biggest challenge is not necessarily that businesses are or are not hiring, it's being able to get workers to do the work that they need. And that is really the challenge. And as you can see, about almost 30% of small businesses out there, they have openings and they've had openings. And it's a matter of trying to fill those openings and get the right people into those openings. That remains perhaps an even bigger challenge for small businesses. And I do think it has an effect in their ability to grow, and obviously it does have an effect on their ability to grow their business. With respect to consumers, they continue to kind of lead the trail, and as you can see, their confidence continues to improve. They're almost back up to that 100 mark in the Consumer Confidence Index. Looking at consumer sentiment, which is a separate measure, and you can see that it did take a little bit of a dip in 2015, but it has also started to improve some. Just a matter of seeing what direction it takes going forward. My feeling is that once the primaries are over, we're going to start to see, I think, a lot less uncertainty and negativity being presented by politicians. I think that you'll start to see less of that, and I think that when that occurs and you start moving into that general election cycle, where there will be differences on policy, and they may focus on specific issues. I think in general they'll go away from discussing and trying to present the overall economy in as pessimistic or as negative terms as they have more recently. Now, one thing, however, that does have to be taken into consideration, and it leads into the final part of this presentation, which is about the future and really about looking at a few things in particular, is the issue of inequality. Politicians have talked about this, but inequality is an issue overall with respect to the economy. The fact that those lines are increasing is not a good sign. The Gini ratio with respect to income is really, its continued growth is a continued reflection of inequality. And the real indication, of course, is that there is a disparity with respect to race and culture, as you can see there, between the red line, which represents black households, and the green line representing white households. And again, that can be noticeable in a lot of different ways, and particularly in locations. Particularly what you will notice is when you look at metropolitan areas, you see how that does have an effect. And it is something that has to be addressed by a multitude of factors. It's not my place to make political statements. It's not my place to necessarily say how these are fixed. But obviously these differences and disparities have to be addressed, especially because of the challenges that are coming forward, which I will conclude with here in a second. Some of the challenges that we continue to see that will have an effect on the economy, both from a private perspective and a public policy perspective. One having to be the issue of health insurance. Hold on just a second. Health insurance is a concern. Realize, of course, it's a concern for businesses. There's also the issue of Medicaid. And that ties back into the Affordable Care Act in terms of the affordability of the government continuing to play the role that it has with respect to health insurance. Infrastructure. A lot of states have done overall a good job in shoring up their finances during this time. And North Carolina's state government has done a good job. But the question that a lot of people have asked is, have they really taken the opportunity to put themselves in a position to take on the challenges of rebuilding and repairing infrastructure? And particularly because of the continued dependence upon gas taxes and the fact that states have not really looked at how they're going to change those funding formulas in today's economy, there's going to be a lot of challenges there. But in my opinion, the biggest challenge that we face is the continued impact of disruption. And this is really economic disruption and how it affects labor forces, how it affects individuals, and how it affects families, and also how it can affect a region like Rocky Mount. What we have seen in the last 25 years here in Rocky Mount with the challenges of globalization and also of technology, those are going to continue to have an effect moving forward. I put this chart out there, and again, this is very wonkish, but what it does is it shows a challenge that a lot of areas have had, and again, it ties back to disruption. And what we have seen overall with metro areas in North Carolina is that their growth has been tied, those metropolitan areas that have seen growth since the last recession have seen it, are the ones that are less dependent upon manufacturing. And that puts some metropolitan areas like Raleigh and Durham and Charlotte and Asheville in a more favorable position, and it put other metropolitan areas in a less favorable position. And this is just a reflection of that. If I was also to do a chart like this and showed the impact of education, of the percentage of people who have 2-year degrees, the percentage of people who have 4-year degrees, you would see that there is a positive relationship between that and employment growth. And again, certain metropolitan areas have been on the good side of that, and others have not. So really, manufacturing, the role of, in terms of how much of your pre-recession economy was tied to manufacturing, and then the educational well-being of your population in a metropolitan area, those have had huge impacts on where the jobs have gone in terms of growth in the last several years. But The same disruptions in technology and globalization that we have seen to affect manufacturing in the last 25 years are now going to start taking effect in the service sector. This report was done about a year ago, and it shows that there are several industries where there is a likelihood, even the one that I like to play in with respect to economics, where there is a likelihood of jobs being lost to technology, to automation in particular. Now, in some of these, they've been adjusted, and it doesn't mean that all the jobs are going to be gone. And it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a demand for workers in the support of these. But the fact is that as the economy continues to move forward and as technology and its capacities continue to advance, there is going to be, we are starting to see how technology is going to start reducing opportunities with respect to service industry jobs. We've seen how technology's had an effect in disrupting manufacturing, such as auto manufacturing. But the others pictures that you see there, and again, three of these pictures are overall from Dr. Abernathy. The one that's at the bottom is from me. We've seen the thing about driverless cars. Well, eventually that's going to lead to driverless big rigs, like the one that you see there from that's got Walmart's wrapping on it. I would imagine that at the point that driverless big rigs become fully tested, I could see a lot of insurance companies going to trucking services and saying, you guys need to put these into effect, because they're going to say that the chance for accidents and the chance for lost time is going to be less. Plus, you're not going to have to worry about deadheading or about drivers being out of sight or others. You're also going to see robots potentially take on more roles in healthcare, including being home health providers and providing assistance. The one thing that we've already started seeing, and you may use it, my family certainly uses it, and it's probably one of the first ways people are going to see the effect of technology, is with respect to food service. That picture I took at Zaxby's this past weekend, and it shows that you can now, even before you show up, place your order online. Of course, people have been doing this with pizza for a while. You can, when my family goes to Panera in Raleigh, we do it. We place the order online, and it's already ready for us before we get there. And of course, those are potentially mutually beneficial relationships for the customer and for the business. The customer feels like they're getting a faster order and they're getting a more accurate order because it's being done through a computer. The business person is looking at greater efficiency and the reduction of labor cost. Of course, there's a loser in the transaction, and that's the person who had been working at the counter, who is no longer needed to actually process that order. So that's an example of some of the disruption that we're going to continue to see. And that disruption will affect areas differently. This is the last main slide that I have, and it looks at some information that was provided recently from North Carolina State University's Institute of Emerging Issues. They've actually been doing research on the likelihood of disruption and vulnerability to disruption at the county level. And what they found in particular is that the region of eastern North Carolina that we are a part of is highly susceptible to this disruption. And as you can see, the lower the number in that map down in the bottom right, the more vulnerable we are. Meanwhile, directly to our west, you look at the triangle area, and they're the least vulnerable to disruption. And that does have an effect with respect to not just the local economy, but our ability to attract people to make sure that we build it. So the goal for us moving forward, and the real focus, that one of the focus areas that we need to have with respect to what businesses are doing, with respect to what's going on with public policy, is how do we reduce that vulnerability? How do we put ourselves in a position to be less vulnerable? Because obviously the vulnerability and the disruption that we have faced here in the last period of time has had an effect on the economy, and we obviously want to see the economy grow moving in the future. And this last slide here talks a little bit about pay. This is the effect. This can also be another effect of disruption, because it does affect the nature of the jobs that are available, and you can see that is going to be a challenge as well. That is all that I have at this point. I know we got a little bit of time left, and we started a little late, so we may need to go a little long, but I'm happy to take your questions at this time.
Hey, Ken, it's Teresa. Greg Dowd and I do have a question. On one of your slides, you showed the increase in GDP, what was causing it, and you had mining industry or mining sector, 19.4%. Where are we mining in North Carolina?
You've got, well, let me go back to that one. Well, you're not mining much to the east unless you're talking about mining rock. But obviously, here recently, Hanson expanded its quarry facilities in the last couple of years with their facility out towards NC 97. But,
So aggregates are quarries.
Say again?
Quarries.
Well, I mean, that's one example. I'm not as familiar with North Carolina's mining industry as I probably should be. Obviously, it's not fracking. That's one thing that it's not, and it's not coastal oil exploration. But you do, of course, have some mining in western North Carolina that's continuing to go on. It's probably not as much in the energy mining. I would say it's probably more in raw materials, as well as perhaps into some other specialty materials. But it's not a huge sector. It's not a very large sector of North Carolina's economy. So that increase, while significant, can be a little deceptive. And also, I will say that there was a period of time during the recession where it also shrank significantly. So if I had provided information, say, for a 5-year period of time, those numbers may have been more in line with the others.
Okay. All right. And then my other question is, when you see a negative 2.4% under transportation and warehousing, that is logistics, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Thank you.
I was listening to the director of the Future School of Business at Duke University, and he was saying a recent survey of leading economists showed that the chance of recession has doubled from last year. Up to 31% of those surveyed indicated they thought there would be a downturn by the end of the year. Do you agree with that?
I don't know if it's going to necessarily happen by the end of the year. The challenge that we've seen the last couple of years with GDP is that when that first quarter number comes out, they've actually seen a reduction. It's almost like, in the last 2 years, they've blamed it on weather, particularly in the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Midwest. It is clear that the first 3 months of this year are not going to be a strong period. But if we remember, technically a recession is presented when you have two consecutive quarters of economic decline in terms of a reduction in GDP. I'm aware that there's some people thinking it's going to happen this year. I think next year, if we do see a recession, is more likely. It'll be driven by a couple of different factors. I think that there's kind of a placebo effect in terms of the election itself and the political process. And also there's also the effect, there's going to be some effect of how other markets around the world are going to have some influence on our economy. We're not as exposed. That was something that was talked about when I went to Raleigh earlier this year. Some of the economists that work out of Charlotte, that work a lot with the Richmond Fed's office there, will tell you that overall our exposure to the global economy is not as great, particularly the concerns about China. But there is some there, and it's going to have some effect. Obviously, I think the other factor is we have been in a period of economic growth now for a very long time. It's been about 6 years. And that means that eventually the economy is going to correct itself. There's going to be a recession. So I don't know when it's going to be. I don't see it happening before the end of 2016. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen in 2017. But I'm not going to make a prediction.
Okay, thanks.
Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to add?
Ken, let me ask you concerning the growth factors in the area. Do we see more growth in major business and industry, or more growth in the small business sector?
I would say it's a combination of both. We've had some announcements with respect to larger industries. And again, I think the bigger challenge for both larger industry and for smaller business is just trying to find people to do the work. But at the same time, we've also seen some small business openings. We have activity going on in the central city of Rocky Mount that is going to have a positive effect. We are seeing some business startups. So I think it is a combination. Obviously, if we could succeed in bringing some more larger industry or medium-sized industry to our area, that would have a noticeable positive effect. But right now, I do think it's a mix. And I think that the more capable we are at being able to fill the vacancies that are out there and connect the qualified people who are here, who in some ways are challenged finding out about these jobs. Our labor market, our ability to promote and market our openings is a little bit challenged. I think the more that we can get that information out there and the more that we can work to connect people with skills that are here locally with job opportunities, I think the better off we'll be.
Okay.
Clint, did you have anything that you wanted to bring up?
One thing I'll just put out there, and this is very high level, but there is, and like you said, the United States is not necessarily tied to the entire global market, but one thing that is having a conversational impact right now in the financial industry is the negative interest rates in Europe. We are not in that position, but we are having discussions about it. If it came to that, or what is the operational nature of the financial industry to handle it?
Well, and I'll just add as well, there wasn't a time that long ago where the inflation index treasuries, that they were in negative territory. Obviously, and I mean, you think about it, people were, much like with what the Europeans are seeing, and obviously, they are not in as good of a situation as we are. So I don't want to make people think. We're certainly not in their situation, and they've got serious structural problems.
Hey, just to clarify, the ECB today has set their interest rate at negative 0.4%.
Oh my! Well, I knew that they had talked about the QE. I didn't realize they'd set the rate at negative 0.4.
Yeah.
Oh my! That's because we didn't. The Treasury. The Treasury didn't even go. Our Treasury didn't even go that far ever. We may have dumped cash in the market, but we certainly never did anything like that. But again, I at some point it's gonna. At some point those are going to have an effect on inflation. At some point there's going to be a run up. And you hope that it's slow enough that people can see it and take the necessary action. But it is going to have an effect. For example, going back to the issue of politics, one of the things that comes up a lot in elections is the whole concept of reducing corporate tax rates to facilitate repatriation. The reality is that if you repatriate the money, even if it's in the hands of a business, that's going to dramatically increase the domestic money supply, which may accelerate inflation beyond what you would want to see. So there are some things out there that when you hear politicians talk about them, it sounds good, but there are externalities that could have significant negative consequences.
On the local level, it's not as big of an impact, because what we are talking about here is the bankers' banks, the central
right.
bank, not the actual banks themselves, but it does affect the tolerance for lending.
Mm-hmm.
And trickle down into the small business world and continue to be a pressure mechanism to not release more funds or to be riskier.
Absolutely, and and the picture overall with financing availability is that it has certainly improved, but there have been, and I didn't post anything up there about credit capacities or lending activity, but and Clint, if I get anything wrong here, you can clarify. Overall, the trends are improving, but there are still periods of hiccup, and there are still sectors, including small business, where they are still facing challenges. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank everybody for joining us.